皆様、本日はお忙しいところ。
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for coming to the JIIA forum with the title of What American Public Opinion Tells Us About the 2018 Midterm Elections and Beyond. We have the honor of having Mr. Bruce Stokes from Pew Research Center. I would like to call upon Mr. Sasai, Ambassador Sasai, the JIIA's president, to give us the opening remark. Good afternoon. Thank you very much for coming, in spite of your tight schedule, to join us at this JIIA Open Forum. I would like to take this opportunity to thank you very much from the bottom of my heart. Today we have the honor of having Mr. Bruce Stokes of Pew Research Center to discuss the midterm elections and its impact, not only the U.S., but Japan, Asia, global areas as a whole. Today, in addition to Mr. Stokes, we have Mr. Morrison from Pew Research Center's Vice President. And he is a watchdog over Mr. Bruce Stokes. So I would like to welcome Mr. Morrison as well. Well, I don't like to speak for a long time, but as you know, the Pew Research Center concerning the Japanese public opinion, in contrast to the U.S. and other countries' public opinions, Pew Research Center gives us the perspective to compare the public opinions. We look at domestic scenes or bilateral aspects, but Pew Research Center gives us a more objective way to look at the situation. So the research results, not all, but most of the results, I look through, and the research results helped my work as an ambassador. After the presentation, there will be a Q&A session. Please take the opportunity to ask questions or make comments. Now, without further ado, Mr. Bruce Stokes.
Sasai-san, Mr. Ambassador, it's really a pleasure and a privilege to be here, and what an honor to be back at the Institute. I have had the unique opportunity to speak here a number of times, and I've always really enjoyed your questions because often they raise issues that we hadn't thought about, or they give us an opportunity to think about what we should ask in the future, or maybe you have an interpretation of the data that we don't have. So I really look forward to the conversation we can have after the presentation of this data. I'd like to preface this by making a couple of comments about public opinion in general. Public opinion does not predict what's going to happen in the future. I realize that's what we all care about, is what it means next. But it does give us a sense of what the mood was like in a moment, a snapshot of the mood, in this case, either in the run-up to the U.S. election or on Election Day itself. And I'll let you draw your own conclusions about what that means for the future, but I think there's a lot of information there that can help inform what we all think might happen next year, because that's obviously what we, as we go to the closure of this year, what we're going to see in the next year is what we're all increasingly concerned about or interested in or want to try to anticipate. And obviously the role of the United States at this moment in U.S.-Japan relations, relations with China, relations with the world in general, it seems to me is terribly important and changing. And I think so it's important that we understand U.S. public opinion better, because that's going to inform the political decisions that get made, both by the White House and also by the Congress going forward. I'd also like to recognize I see a number of old friends in the audience, and I'd like to thank you for coming, and it's really great to see you all again. And I look forward to your comments in particular, because I learned so much from you, some of you who I know, over the years, and some of us go back 30 years, so it's great to see you all. Briefly, Pew Research Center is based in Washington. We are a nonprofit, non-advocacy, nonpartisan research group. We do public opinion research and also increasingly big data research. We're funded by the Pew Charitable Trust, one of those wonderful old American foundations that was created with 19th century money, basically. And what's nice about the Pew Charitable Trust is they firmly believe that good public policy comes from good information. I'm not so sure everybody believes that these days, but we do, and we're committed to that. All of the material I'm going to talk to you about today is available on our website. It is free, but most importantly, it's searchable, and it goes back, in some cases, more than 2 decades. So if you ever are wondering, and it's global. We've done surveys in over 100 countries. We do Japan every year. In fact, we just released this week a new survey of Japanese public opinion. I'll mention that in passing as we go forward. So there's very interesting material on our website that you might find of interest. As we think about this election, going into the election, as you know, those of you who follow the United States, every 2 years we re-elect the House of Representatives, the 435 members of the House of Representatives, and a third of the Senate. So the biggest change always comes in the House of Representatives because the entire House of Representatives has to get re-elected. After the results were in on Tuesday of last week, we now will have changed the majority in the House of Representatives for 4 midterm elections in a row. If you step back from that, it suggests the American public is very volatile in there. Now, we can say this is good for democracy and it's great to have change, but it's also a volatility we hadn't seen in the past. So I think it's one comment we can draw from the outcome of the election. The president went into the election with relatively low public approval based on past presidencies. You'll see that actually what that might have meant in the exit polling data, but historically that's been a danger zone for the president because historically the first midterm election in the first term of a president, in other words, for Barack Obama in 2010, or in this case for Donald Trump in the first, is a referendum on the president. It is about him. It's not ever been a her yet, maybe someday, but it's about him. And so you'll see that I think it was a referendum on him again. And finally, the Republicans faced a particular challenge because there were so many Republican retirements. So many Republicans had retired. There were a lot of open seats that they had to defend. In the run-up to the election, there was great enthusiasm about the election. Enthusiasm usually translates into high turnout. We now think there was actually a relatively high turnout in the American election. The most recent estimate I've seen was 49% turnout, which frankly is not that good, but for midterm elections it's very good, which often is like 40%. We won't have the final turnout figures now for a while. It takes forever to figure out exactly how many people voted. But if it's around 49, 50%, that's really good for a midterm election. And the enthusiasm was on both sides. It wasn't just the Democrats. It was the Republicans as well. The voters said that control of Congress was an important issue to them, and both Republicans and Democrats said that. But you should understand, and we'll see this again and again in this data, for those of you who know America, I'm sure you say, well, I understand America's really partisan. You have no idea. The partisanship of the United States is greater today than at any time in modern history. Now, our data only goes back to the 90s, but the partisanship is getting wider and wider. The differences are getting more and more. And as you can see, this is just, how do you feel about the other party? And 4 in 10 Republicans and 4 in 10 Democrats have a very negative view of the other party. So that's just one indicator of how partisan it's been. As those of you who have lived in the U.S. or follow the U.S. know, there are polls done, not by us, but by the other major polling organizations, what are called exit polls, where you ask people as they walk out of the fire hall or the school after they voted, what is it, what do you think about this or that? So what I'm going to show you is some of the exit polling data. On Election Day, the most important issue for people was health care. The Democrats had emphasized health care in their campaign, and it seems that, that's what people were worried about. Now, we don't know what that means. Was it the cost of health care? Was it the availability of health care? Was it the fear that they might lose their health care? All we know is that health care was a big issue. Notice that 23% said immigration was a big issue. Now, remember, the president made a big deal about immigration in the run-up to the election. Now, again, we don't know for certain. I mean, one of the dirty little secrets of public opinion polling is you don't know what the respondent was thinking when they gave you the answer. Were they thinking that immigration is a problem and a threat? Or were they thinking that, oh no, the president wants to deport all these people and I have to stop that? We don't know but they said immigration. And one of the interesting questions will be going forward, does the president look at that data and say, oh, immigration worked as a political issue, I should do more of this? We just don't know. But it polled very high on Election Day. Interesting question. People were asked, is the country more united or less united? And overwhelmingly people said, we're becoming less united. Now, among those who said we're becoming more united, it was overwhelmingly Republicans who said that. And among those who said it's less united, it was overwhelmingly Democrats. This is an interesting finding, because usually how the people view the direction of the country and the direction of the economy go hand in hand. And you often don't know whether you even need to ask about the direction of the country if you ask about the direction of the economy. In fact, the survey we just did about Japan, we just released this week, almost the exact same number of Japanese were approved of the direction of the country and who said they approved of the economy. So they were just like neck and neck. Here we got a difference. Notice that 68% of those who voted on Election Day said the economy is doing pretty well. Well, in fact, it is. The unemployment rate is lower than it has been in 50 years. But still, a majority of people said the country's on the wrong track. So clearly, there's something else they're upset about besides the economy. And again, overwhelmingly, among those who said it was on the right track, it was Republicans. Among those who said the economy is doing well, it was Republicans. And notice 83% of Democrats say the economy is doing poorly. I'm not quite sure what economy they're living in, but it does suggest that, at least among Democratic voters who are either young people or minorities or women, often, they aren't necessarily seeing, they claim not to see all the benefits of this very, very good economy. We asked people about President Trump. He polled at 45% approval. The interesting thing about that is he didn't poll that well in the run-up to the election in most polls. Remember that in 2016, he received 47% of the vote, even though he didn't poll that well in the run-up to the election. So he does seem, at least based on those two data points, to poll better on Election Day than he does in the run-up. So as you think about 2020 and you see the approval ratings, whatever they're going to be, bear in mind that in 2016 and 2018 on Election Day, he did better than whatever the number was before. We asked people, was your vote in this House of Representatives election in support of Trump or opposing to Trump? About a quarter said it was to support Trump. Almost 4 in 10 said it was opposing Trump. Again, not surprisingly, the people who said it was support of Trump were overwhelmingly Republican, and the people who opposed Trump it was overwhelmingly Democrat. So it was a referendum on the president. As you well know, the president's being investigated for his relations with the Russians in the run-up to the 2016 election. What is interesting is that among the people who voted on Election Day, a majority say this is a politically motivated investigation. It is not justified. And only 39% say they would like to see the president impeached. Now, I would point out to you that while 39% doesn't seem to be a strong level of support for impeachment at this moment, that's higher than the support for the impeachment of Bill Clinton before he was impeached. It's roughly comparable to the support for impeachment when Richard Nixon was impeached. So even though 39% doesn't seem like a high number, there's precedent, at least in my lifetime, of someone still being impeached, even though the public is not necessarily in support of it. People were asked, does President Trump's foreign policy make you feel safer or less safe? The plurality response is less safe. Again, highly partisan. What about Donald Trump's immigration policy? Are they too tough or not tough enough? Basically, people say they're too tough. So that may give us some incentive. When people said immigration was the third most important issue when I voted, this would appear to suggest what many of them meant was, I don't like what he's doing, rather than I like what he's doing. But immigration was an issue. Obviously important to a Japanese audience. What about the president's trade policies? How do you feel about those? What's interesting is how divided people were on this. The plurality response was, they have had no impact. And 29% say they've hurt my community, and 25% say they've helped my community. Again, highly partisan. But it would appear that most Americans, well, I can't say most, but that many Americans don't actually see the impact of this at all. So, which suggests it's not that important of an issue to them. This, to my mind, is one of the more disturbing answers in the exit polling data from Election Day. People were asked, in American society, are whites favored or minorities favored? And Republicans said minorities are favored, and Democrats said whites are favored. It's just a reminder that race remains a very divisive issue in the United States, even after we elected an African American as president. People still have very strong racial attitudes. As you think about the future, next year, will the democratically controlled House of Representatives cooperate with the Republican Senate? Will Democrats cooperate with the Republican White House? And vice versa. We have for years asked people, do you want your elected representative to compromise with the other side or stand on principle? And for years, Republicans said, no, I want my my elected representatives to stand on principle, and Democrats said, no, I want my elected representative to compromise. And at the time, the thing was, well, how can you have a compromise when only one side wants to compromise? Well, now, for the first time, both Democrats and Republicans are saying, I want my elected representative to stand on principle and not compromise. So now you have both sides, in terms of the voters, saying to their elected representative, don't compromise with those other guys. And so what this means for the future, I don't know, but it's not necessarily what you want in a democracy, because the definition of democracy is supposed to be compromise over time. What are the implications for the stance in the U.S.? This is a very, very important question, I think. We ask people, do other countries take advantage of the United States? 80% of Republicans say other countries take advantage of the United States, and only 28% of Democrats say other countries take advantage of the United States. As you well know, President Trump says other countries take advantage of the United States, including you. It resonates with the base in the Republican Party. Now, frankly, we don't know how many of those Democrats truly believe that other countries don't take advantage of the United States, or is it because Donald Trump says they do, then I say they don't? That is one of the challenges we face in understanding American public opinion today. It is so partisan. You're never quite sure whether the response you get is in response to the question you asked, or is it tribal? And we don't have an answer for that, but 20 years ago, an equal number of Democrats and Republicans said, oh, foreigners take advantage of us, and now only 28% of Democrats say that? I mean, what's changed? Now, the composition of the party has changed. More minorities, more women, more young people. So maybe that's why the Democratic number has gone down. But notice the Republican number has not gone down. This is a question, or a kind of unilateralism question. Does the U.S. take into account, or should the U.S. take into account, the interest of our allies when we're making foreign policy, even if that means we have to compromise with them? Notice that overwhelmingly the Democrats say, yes, we should take it. We should compromise with our allies. We should not act unilaterally. And only 36% of Republicans say we should compromise with allies. So, again, another defining difference between Republicans and Democrats, with Republicans supporting unilateralism and Democrats not. Trade, obviously a very important issue. I can tell you, because we study trade very deeply at Pew, it really depends on how you ask the question. Now, that's the case in all public opinion, but it's particularly true about trade. The red number there is a very broad question we ask periodically, which is trade good for the country? At that very high level of abstraction, principled, 30,000-foot question, we overwhelmingly as a people say trade's good for the country. We buy that. The blue line is, what about trade agreements? Are trade agreements good for the country? And then the public's, well, I'm not so sure about trade agreements. It's only 56% who say trade agreements are good for the country. But think about that. We are asking people, do you want your government to further open the U.S. economy to more foreign competition? And then, if that's what you mean about trade, I'm not so sure. So it depends on the specificity of the question. It's highly partisan. Democrats tend to say trade agreements are good for the country, and Republicans tend to say trade agreements are bad for the country. Notice it's gone down, actually, since in recent years among Republicans, and you have a president who says these trade agreements, at least in the past, were no good for the country. Again, overwhelmingly, Americans say trade's good for the country, but when you ask a very specific question, does trade create jobs? No. Does it raise wages? No. Does it lower prices? No. And that's been consistent over time. Now, the percentage of Americans who say trade creates jobs has gone up a little bit. The percentage of Americans who say trade raises wages has gone up a little bit. And we know from analysis that if you believe the economy is doing well, then you're more likely to say trade creates jobs and raises wages. So there is a connection between how you feel about the economy. But it's still not enough to make it a majority, right? It's still a strong minority. This is a great question, and we didn't ask it. Gallup asks it. Who are fair traders? Do you think Japan's a fair trader? Do you think Canada's a fair trader? A majority of Americans today think you all are fair traders. We don't think the Chinese are fair traders. So, one conclusion is, we can only have one enemy at a time, and it's China. But notice the change over time. That, to my mind, is one of the two most interesting things about this question. A quarter of Americans thought you were fair in 1993. Now a majority of Americans think you are a fair trader. So that has changed dramatically in the last, 25 years or whatever. Also notice that, and I think it's hard for those of us of a certain age to remember this, as recently as 1993, China was such a minor player in the world economy that Gallup didn't even think it was worth asking about China. I mean, I just find that amazing. But they didn't, and now they do, and we think they're unfair. This is also, I think, terribly important as you think about the future of U.S.-Japan trade relations and U.S. trade relations with the rest of the world. Notice, if I can get the pointer here. Notice the Japan line. 21% of Republicans in 1993 said Japan was a fair trader. Now it's 46. Okay, it's doubled, right? That's good. Up 25 percentage points. But it went up much more among Democrats than Republicans. So, and if you aren't sure whether this is partisan or not, look at what happened to Canada. 81% of Republicans in 1993 said Canada was a fair trader. Now only 49% of Republicans say Canada is a fair trader. Those of you who have worked on trading, what is Canada doing differently today? The issues between U.S. and Canada were the same today as they were 25 years ago. It's lumber, it's milk, it's salmon. The difference is you have a Republican president saying Canada's unfair. Rhetoric, presidential rhetoric matters in these matters. We've imposed tariffs on steel. We've imposed tariffs on aluminum. We're threatening to impose tariffs on autos. About half of Americans say these are bad for the country. But again, it's overwhelmingly partisan. Republicans say these tariffs are going to be good for the country, and Democrats say no, they're going to be bad for the country. And see if I've got that. Yeah, no. One of the interesting things, you break this down more, I dare say some of you might think that, well, better educated people realize that tariffs are bad for the economy. Think again. Republicans with a college education or more say tariffs are good for the country. Democrats with a college education or more say tariffs are bad for the country. Were Democrats the only ones who studied economics in college? I don't think so. I think that it's partisanship, right? It's just, I don't know how else you describe it. This is an interesting question that CNN asked. They said, what's more important, protecting U.S. industry or maintaining good relations with allies? You all should feel good about this. 63% of Americans said maintaining good relations with allies is more important. But again, it's highly partisan. Democrats say that. Republicans actually say protecting U.S. industry is more important. China is obviously a looming issue in international affairs going forward next year. Support for China is down a little bit this year in the United States, and it's less than 50% who are favorably disposed towards China. It's never been higher than about 51 or 52, but it's kind of going south at this point. We're increasingly worried about Chinese economic strength. It's gone up pretty much in the last 2 years. When we ask the American public, what are the biggest problems facing China? It's they hold our debt. Nobody loves a creditor. It's the trade deficit. It's the loss of jobs. What's interesting is that nearly 6 in 10 Americans say cyber attacks from China. I can tell you several years ago, we didn't even ask about cyber attacks from China. It is a dramatically kind of rising concern among America and in Japan as well. I mean, just all over the world. And I think the explanation is that these cyber attacks are actually affecting average people. You know, people lose their credit card or their information and they think or they're told it was China. And so it's become personal in a way that some of these other things may be more abstract. Republicans are more worried about economics issues with China than are Democrats. Democrats are more worried about China's impact on the environment than. Now, what's interesting is that nobody's worried about Taiwan anymore. Now, again, I am of an age, when I was growing up, I remember the shelling of Quemoy and Matsu, and oh my God, this is going to lead to World War III. And now when we ask about tensions between China and Taiwan, it's like 1 out of 5 people think that's a big problem. It's just off the radar screen in the United States. One final thing, to go back to the trade issue, because obviously that's a big issue for U.S.-Japan relations going forward as we start negotiations on this trade agreement. It's clear from the data that if you ask Americans about trade, they have an opinion. They don't say they don't know. They have an opinion. They think it's good for the country. They're not so sure the trade agreements are good for the country, and they think the trade destroys jobs and it lowers wages, and they're not convinced of the personal value. But they don't really care about trade. And when you ask people, as we did in October, here are 12 different issues. How important are each of these issues to you as you think about how you're going to vote in November? 55% of Americans said trade is a very important issue as I think about how I'm going to vote in November. There were 10 issues that were more important out of 12. So again, I don't think we should overinterpret Americans' attitudes about trade from public opinion in the sense that, even though I'm an old trade guy, so I want it to be the most important issue in the world, the reality is people have an opinion about trade. They don't really care that much about it. And, let's face it, the United States is still largely a continental economy. We trade as a percentage of our total GDP far less than many other countries. So it's grown rapidly, but it's still relatively low. So it makes total sense that people might say, remember back to that issue about, have these trade policies affected you? And the plurality answer was no, not at all, not positively or negatively. So I do think as we go forward next year, and there's a lot of more discussion about a free trade agreement, or we don't call it that, but a trade agreement between Japan and the United States, you may see data that says, well, people are really upset about this or that, but also put it in context that relative to other things, this is not a terribly important issue for you. In fact, we will ask in January, here are 24 issues that face the country in the year ahead. We've been doing this for 20 years. For 20 years, trade is the least important of the 24 issues, except sometimes climate change is the least important. So again, it's not that people don't have an opinion about trade. It's just it's not that important to them. So again, I think you need to put that kind of in context as you think about the future of U.S.-Japan relations around trade. So I've talked way too long, and I'm really looking forward to your comments, questions, whatever.
Stokes さん、ありがとうございました。
Thank you very much, Mr. Stokes. Now we'd like to open questions from the floor. If you have any question, please raise your hand, and we will be designating you. Please identify yourself, your name and affiliation before you ask a question.
Consultant, thank you very much for the brilliant presentation. I have two quick questions. If my memory doesn't fail me, Mr. Trump used to be some stranger in the Republican Party 2 years ago, but now he's the standard in the Republican Party. Where are the internationalists or moderates in the Republican Party? Where have they gone? My first question.
If you could find them, could you let us know?
The second question is about the so-called Christian conservatives.
Yes.
Are they expanding, and if so, why?
Well, that we know from the exit polling data, at least, that the president's strongest support came from evangelical Christians, white evangelical Christians. Whether that's expanding or not, I don't know, and I'm not sure the data would tell us. But that is a core group that has remained very loyal to him. And it's true, I think, that a lot of the Republican internationalists, which used to be a large part of the party, are gone from the scene. You know, John McCain died. Some have been defeated or retired. I always think it's interesting that, you know, Donald Trump was really the candidate in 2016 in the Republican primaries who understood that the base of the Republican Party had changed and that it was not the, you know, your grandfather's Republican Party. You know, he defeated some candidates, I think, who were campaigning like the old Republicans. They were for free trade, they were for immigration, and that didn't work out too well for them. And to Donald Trump's credit, I think, you know, he both personally believed these things, but he also understood that the base of the party had changed and was successful as a result. Yeah.
Thank you. My name is Cota, former diplomat, involved sometimes in the trade negotiations.
And you bear the scars of that, right?
You said that trade agreements are unpopular with the American general public.
Less popular. There's still a majority support them, yeah.
Okay. But then you have a president who seems not only to dislike trade agreements, but goes as far as to say, perhaps appear disliking the WTO itself. And you already know for sure that there are efforts within the WTO to reform itself.
Yeah.
And last week we had Azevedo here saying that he was encouraged to see the U.S. representatives still engaged in those reform efforts. But to my view, I mean, if you believe what the president is saying, it appears to me that whatever effort we make within the framework of reforming the WTO will not satisfy him. But in your opinion, do you think that there's a chance of sort of placating President Trump by engaging in this reform exercise or not?
I mean, look, we don't know how the public thinks about this. We asked a question about the WTO years and years ago, and it was, you know, fairly positive, but that was years ago. We haven't asked it again because we have made a decision we think is right that, you know, people would barely know what you're talking about. Now, the president has maybe elevated the public recognition of the WTO a little bit by criticizing it. But I don't know that because we haven't asked the question. You know, we don't know how people feel about the functioning of the WTO. I think it's fair to say you've worked on the WTO issues. I mean, you realize it has not completed a major negotiation since the end of the Uruguay round. So that would suggest that it needs some upgrading, and Azevedo agrees with that, and the U.S. government agrees with it, the Japanese government agrees with it, the European governments agree with that. What form that will take and whether the U.S. will be able to support that, I just think it's too early to tell. The dispute settlement mechanism is also, you know, down to what? Is it 2 judges or 3? So that's another issue that's got to be dealt with in the coming years. I think the focus has been more on China and the tariffs, at least the public focus. We have not asked a question about this proposed U.S.-Japan agreement. My guess is there's probably low recognition that that's even about to happen, just simply because it doesn't get much coverage in the U.S. press, and probably won't get much coverage until it's actually put before Congress, when it'll become an issue that people have to kind of take a position on. But it's really, at these points, in terms of the focus of the public on trade, it's China, China, China.
Thank you very much. My name is Yuichi Tsuzuki. Thank you for your talks. I'm formerly from Gaimshu. I have two questions. One is, well, you get the impression that the young people this time made the difference. I mean, the young Americans. Through your service, do you think that it's going to be a lasting phenomenon that's going to have an impact in 2 years' time, or it's going to go away, and then two years from now it's going to be different? I mean, young people are, volatile. They change their attitude on and off. And the other question is, again, on trade. What will be the attitude of the Democrats in the Congress for the trade negotiations that Trump administration have or will have concluded, including USMCA?
Yeah, no, those are two great questions. I mean, we don't know yet what the turnout rate has been for various groups like blacks or Hispanics or young people. We know that the number of people who voted was up dramatically. First time ever we've had more than 100 million people vote. We think it's about a 49% turnout, which is very high, which would suggest that youth voting is up, minority voting is up, but at least going into the election, we also knew that the Republicans, which is, more maybe disproportionately white, older men, that's up too. Or their enthusiasm was up, so history would suggest their voting patterns are up. Young people have historically voted at a lower rate than adults or their parents or their grandparents in the United States. And so the question is, even if their participation rate went up, how much did it go up? Which might answer your question about, is this sustainable, or even if it goes down a little bit, it's still pretty high. We did a wonderful study earlier this year where we looked at the voter participation rate of young Americans in the first 3 midterm elections they were eligible to vote in. So for my generation, it was in the 70s. And for the millennials, it was the last 3 midterm elections. And what was striking about that, it wasn't that those numbers were low for both generations, and for Gen Xers in the middle as well, but that millennials voted at a lower rate than baby boomers did in the first election we could both vote in. And the difference was 6 percentage points in that first election. By the third election, it was 13 percentage point difference. So it wasn't just that millennials were voting at a lower rate because they're young. They were voting at a lower rate than other young Americans had voted in the past. So they were kind of disengaged even more than we might kind of think, given that they're young. Now, that may change when we get the final data in for this election. But the interesting question will be how did they compare to themselves? How did they compare to other young people? Are they now voting at a higher rate than baby boomers did or Gen Xers did, or are they still voting at a lower rate than, even though it's up? And that'll be an interesting, I think, test of their future impact on the election. And your second question was
Democrats in the Congress. How would they vote on trade?
We don't know, because I think that first off, we have to sign this Mexico-Canada new agreement, NAFTA 2 or USMCA or whatever you're going to call it. The Mexican trade minister was quoted in the paper saying we're going to sign it in Buenos Aires at the G20. I don't know that the U.S. government has said that, or the Canadian government has agreed to that yet. We know that the Canadian ambassador in Washington is going around saying, unless you take the steel tariffs and the aluminum tariffs off the table, we're not going to sign it. Is that a negotiating position, or is that the government? We don't know. But we'll see. I mean, the G20 is coming up. But then it would have to go to Congress. The labor unions have said some positive things about this agreement. They think there's some improvement in labor rights in the agreement, so that might suggest that some of the left of the Democratic Party would support it. We don't know. I would presume there'll be some Democrats who will say, why do we give the president a victory? So that's the countervailing kind of push. It would probably happen in the first half of next year. And it'll be one of the interesting tests because there are very few times when you actually get a vote in Congress on trade. So whatever people's rhetoric is about trade, that's when you kind of, the rubber meets the road and you have, okay, you're either for this or against this. And what we don't know is it'll be interesting to see in the Republican caucus, in the Senate and the House, are they more populist than in the past and, less free trade? Or are the president supports this, so now I support this? So, and the Democrats similarly, are they kind of anti-trade but the unions support this, so then, how does that affect the outcome? And then, of course, the second test would be if we get a Japan deal, it would have to go before Congress. But that won't be till, I would assume, well, the Japanese government tells me they can't do this deal until after the upper house election. So that puts the vote in Congress no earlier than the fall of 2019 or the spring of 2020. I can tell you in Washington, there's very little discussion about the substance of this deal at this point. There will be once the negotiation starts, but it's a long way from testing that vote in Congress.
Koji Watanabe, so nice to see you back. You said trade issue is no longer, or is not upper list on the concern of American public now. I was wondering, in the 1980s, when we were involved in trade negotiations with the United States, was it the same as now, or was it different? I thought the American public was so mad about Japan, and the place of the trade issues, particularly with Japan, was very high on their concern list. What's the difference now?
Koji, it's great to see you. Koji was one of my senseis on trade issues back in the 80s, and I certainly valued his insights. From public opinion point of view, I think it's hard to compare the sentiment back then to now. It's my personal kind of sense is it was worse then, in the sense that people there was this palpable fear that Japan was going to take over and we would all be working for Japanese companies and Japan would own the world. There's not that palpable fear about China in the same way. I mean, there hasn't been the level of a Chinese investment in the U.S. yet. Now, the reality is the trade imbalance between China and the U.S. is much higher than, in a nominal sense, than it ever was with Japan. But I think it's slightly different in the sense that the impact of Japan on the American psyche was in part because it was the first time. And now, even if people don't like it, they've kind of experienced that already. So the China thing is like a second-time experience. So it's less, I think, unsettling to people. I mean, to give you an example, back in the 80s when we first knew each other, I remember talking to a group of United Auto Workers representatives, like local leaders who'd come to Washington. And we're obviously talking about Japan and autos. And one guy in the back of the room raised his hand and he said, Mr. Stokes, I don't understand. How could Japan do this to us? We beat them in World War II. And, it was so poignant because I wanted to say to the guy, that was 40 years ago already. But, in his mind, it was like, it was once and forever, right? And I think that it was part of the psychological shock of that, which is certainly, I think, different today, where people may not like what's going on with China. They may be upset. But our data is very clear. They don't like the trade deficit. They don't like China holding a lot of our debt. They think it's destroying jobs. There's an MIT study, great MIT study that shows that, there was this impact of China joining the WTO on jobs in the United States, and in fact, it had a political impact in those congressional districts. A level of detail of data we don't have from the Japan experience, but having lived through that Japan shock, it does seem to me that it was in many ways more profound simply because people had to accustom themselves to the fact that we were not the only country in the world and everybody else was flat on their back. Just personally, in growing up, the idea that we would buy stuff from Japan. Why would you buy stuff from Japan? It was, it was cheap and why would, trivial. I remember the first time I ever saw a Japanese car. It was an import. And my friends and I went up to it and shook it and laughed. It was small. You could actually shake. You remember American cars back then? They were like tanks. And I think it was representative of the psychological adjustment Americans had to make to the fact that we were now in a global economy where there was actually competition. And whoever. I don't know who's supposed to call on this, but yeah.
Can I ask
The
follow-up?
Yeah.
Thank you very much, Bruce. Shota Oshima from IIS. Yes. As a follow-up, how has the demographic changed over the 30 years since the times when we were the, public enemy number one to the current state where China is, almost becoming one? Over the years, I noticed that there's much more greater acceptance of diversity.
Yeah.
And there are more Asian Americans. I won't say Chinese Americans, but more whereas
Asian Americans are the fastest growing minority group in the United States. Yeah.
So how has that demographic change impacted on the image of China as a representative of Asia against Japan when there was no other competition? That's one first. If I may just follow up, a second question. Do you have a regional or state-to-state breakdown of voter patterns, ethnic, racial patterns, and its demographic dynamics?
I don't know of any studies that have tried to correlate, the growing Asian American population in particular with attitudes towards China and, how does that compare from the past to attitudes towards Japan. It'd probably be really hard to do because in most public opinion surveys, they're just not big enough to pick up those kind of fine details. Because even though Asian Americans are the fastest growing minority group, it's still, well, I forget what the number is, but it's less than 10%. We have on our website 2 surveys we've done of Asian Americans, which I think are the only 2 that have ever been done, and we plan to, I think, maybe do another one. Whether we've ever asked any questions about how Asian Americans feel about China or how they feel about trade, I'd have to go back and look. I just don't know. But certainly, the changing demographics of the United States and the fact that you now have young people who came of age and formed their worldview after China was actually a part of the world, right? Post-WTO accession. end of post-Cold War. If you said to them bamboo curtain and red China, they would look at you like, what are you saying? So that certainly, I think, has affected it. We know from our public opinion surveys that young Americans have a better view of China than older Americans. And when the Chinese would still allow us to survey in China, young Chinese had a better view of America than older Chinese. So I think that we can't dismiss the importance of the fact that you have a whole generation of young people who came of age and formed their worldview after globalization was a fact of life. And I always like to joke, it's asking young people about globalization is kind of like asking them about the sun coming up in the morning. It's like, why are you asking me this? It just is, rather than I have an opinion about it. And the question will be whether they remain as open to the world going forward. And the young people I work with at Pew, they say, we're different than you old guys, and we're more open to the world. So I say, fine, come back to me in 20 years when you have 2 kids and a mortgage and you've divorced and you've lost 3 jobs, and then tell me how open you are to the world. Because do people get more cynical and more just negative as they age? We'll just have to see. We don't know.
Thank you very much for the great talk. My name is Stephen Agee. I'm a visiting fellow here at JIIA and a professor at the International Christian University here in Tokyo, and a Canadian. So I'm a bit shocked by those polls.
A 51st stater, yeah.
Yeah, something like that.
They hate it when we say that.
We hate it. We're going to spoil the milk for you. So my question is one with regards to Vice President Pence's visit to the region. He's talking about security, he's talking about the Indo-Pacific, he's talking about supporting the free and open Indo-Pacific strategy. In your polls, because it didn't come up today, what are people thinking about America's commitment within the region, whether it's alliance partnerships or expanding its security partnerships or footprint within the region? That's my first question. And the second question, based on your data, I'm curious, and you're a social scientist, so you don't predict, but based on your results...
No, I'm just a journalist. But anyway.
But based on your results, what would be your prediction in terms of the upcoming G20 and the visit between Xi Jinping and Donald Trump in terms of some kind of agreement to step away from the trade war? Thank you.
I would never try to predict what Donald Trump's going to do. And, we certainly don't know from the data what's going to happen. In terms of your first question, we have asked people about Americans, about their concerns about China's growing military power. And, in fact, that's going down. Now, we don't know why. But as you know, the South China Sea has kind of receded from the news. We've asked Americans a couple of times now, would you be willing to go to the aid of our Asian allies, and we enumerate them, South Korea, Japan, and the Philippines, if they were attacked by China, and Americans overwhelmingly say yes, and if they were attacked by North Korea, and people say yes. Interestingly enough, Republicans are slightly more supportive of that than Democrats. Which suggests kind of an older kind of, Republicans being kind of more supportive of defensive things than maybe Democrats, but still, it's still a majority of Democrats too. So it's not as wide partisan, just a slight difference. So that would suggest that people remain committed to the region in a strategic sense. In terms of the specific things that the administration is now talking about, the Indo-Pacific, et cetera, I know of no public opinion data that it gets at it. And frankly, if someone in our organization said, let's ask about that, I'd say, do you really think people have thought about this very much or know what you're talking about? I think we have to wait and see until that kind of becomes more clear. Again, China's about trade, I think, for the American public, to the extent that they even, think about this. Yeah.
My name is Cota. I'm a company fellow. I'm a trade guy. Let me ask you a little bit, 2 questions. One is, if there is any fundamental change going on in the United States, it seems to me beyond Trump, there might be new nationalism, and young and sophisticated Trump may take its place in the near future. On the other hand, socialism may prevail among young Democrats or even more radical young people. So the background must be growing anger of ordinary people against extreme unfairness of income distribution. But so far, neither Democrats nor Republicans take fundamental or substantial policies to remedy such a fundamental problem. So that's my first question. The second question is the private sector's role. Business councils in the United States and Japan recently published a joint statement that the free trade is important, including TPP. And the latest Armitage Now report also touched upon the importance of private sectors by referring to Article 2 of Japan-USA Security Treaty. So do you think that the private sectors can play a more proactive role to defend free trade or capitalism, and hopefully they may exert more influence on the Trump administration to come back to TPP someday in the near future? Thank you very much.
There's a lot of questions there. We do know when TPP was still being negotiated that a majority of Americans supported it. Now, I don't think they knew too much about it because it really wasn't a topic of broad conversation in the United States. And what was interesting is in the spring of 2016, when we asked people about trade, and then trade agreements, and we also asked people who do you support for the nomination for a Democrat for president in 2016, a majority of Bernie Sanders supporters thought trade agreements were good for the country, which is a reminder that the candidate's position on issues that the public really doesn't care about may not matter, because Bernie Sanders supporters were disproportionately young people, and they are disproportionately in favor of trade. And so they like Bernie for other reasons, maybe because he was a socialist, or maybe because he stuck his fingers in the eye of the establishment, or we don't know why. But trade wasn't the reason, which suggests that going forward, young people may continue to support globalization, in part, I think, because it's a fact of life to them. And the young people here, I think, would second that. Whereas us old guys had to kind of get used to the idea. The role of the private sector, obviously is important. I think we should remember that in the U.S., business is not very popular, so if business says this is good for you, there may be some people who say, well, yeah, but it's good for you. I'm not sure it's good for me because I don't trust you. There's the kind of the lack of faith in some of the establishment institutions of our society and other societies. It's not just in the U.S. One point I forgot to say in response to Oshima-san's question is that if you look at the exit polling data on that trade question, and where they ask people, has the policies helped you or hurt you, or doesn't matter? I went and looked at the exit polling data in 3 states, in Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania, and it basically was the same they had in the country at large. So even on those states where you might have thought, okay, even if the nation at large says it really doesn't matter, in those states maybe people say it does matter. Well, no. It was kind of the same as the national findings. So it is interesting that regionally it's not at all clear even that these trade policies have risen to the level of the public consciousness saying, okay, this is important and it's helping me or whatever. I think it's just a reminder that people aren't so sure that trade matters to them. Yeah.
Thank you. Matt, I would like to ask about the perception of media. In the last 2 years, we heard so much about fake news, And we see government officials in the U.S. now accepting more the interviews by Fox and CNN being kicked out of the White House. So could you tell us what is happening with regard to perceptions of the public regarding the media?
Well, since I left journalism, the perception has gone down, so. You're absolutely right. The perception of media in the U.S. is pretty low. But more importantly, I think it is deeply partisan. When I was growing up, there were 3 major television networks. They all more or less had the same kind of approach to the news. It was pretty establishment, pretty middle of the road. We do extensive work on media perception in the U.S., and also we just did a big survey on media perception in Europe. We think it's an increasingly important issue. One of the interesting surveys we did a couple of years ago, we asked people a series of values questions. And then based on their answers, we kind of classify people as consistently conservative in their values, somewhat conservative, somewhat, really truly middle of the road, somewhat liberal, very liberal. 40% of consistently conservative people only get their news from Fox News. Not somewhat, only. And 40% of consistently liberal people only get their news from NPR or CNN or MSNBC, which are liberal-leaning news outlets. So it is true, I think, that people are self-selecting their sources of information and kind of self-segregating their sources of information. And it hasn't, it would appear to have an impact. And so I do think that it's a growing issue in the United States. I don't know that anybody's kind of suggested what to do about it, because you're not going to tell people you have to watch Fox News whether you want to or not, or you have to watch, MSNBC whether you want to or not. But it's it's a self-reinforcing loop at both extremes. And what's fascinating to me is it's such an important question to thoughtful people. It comes up in every presentation where people say, "What about the news? What about the media? What do we do about it?" And I don't have an answer. I don't think the data gives us an answer, but I do think it is. The level of awareness of the importance of that issue is really quite striking. And that's why we research it, because we think it's so important. And, we're trying to see if it's a phenomenon similar in Europe. And I'd be curious whether you think it's a growing phenomenon in Japan, because I think that says it's another challenge for our democracies. When we kind of see the world through such partisan lenses. Yeah.
Thank you for your presentation. My name is Tsugami, and I'm an adjunct fellow of this institute. If I remember correctly, in the last report of your center, there was an observation that ordinary American people's view on China, there was no major change.
Yeah.
But this time, as you told, there was a deterioration.
Yeah.
So may we interpret that the American people's view on China has finally started to deteriorate? Could you elaborate?
Yeah, well, actually, last year it went up a little. The favorability actually went up a little bit last year, and then it went back down this year. And, we didn't know why it went up, although, conceivably one of the reasons was, well, okay, now that Donald Trump's in there and he'll do a better job and the relationships will get better. But it's gone back down again. And, there is an interesting pattern in U.S. attitudes towards China. See if I can find it, because I think it's visual. for those of you who kind of studied a little bit of statistics or whatever, it's almost like a sine curve. You know, it kind of goes up for a while, then it goes down for a while, then it goes up for a while. And there seems to be kind of an upper limit to the unfavorability. You know, it doesn't kind of go above 55 or so %. And there's a kind of a lower limit to the favorability. It doesn't go much below 35%. There seems to be a ceiling and a floor. Now, you know, we only have whatever it is, 13 years of data, but it's one of the, I think, the values of the work we do is that we do have this longitudinal data, and we can say, okay, well, there seems to be some kind of a pattern there. I mean, doesn't mean there always will be a pattern, but you know, things kind of get better, and then they get worse, and then they get better, and then they get worse, and they go up and down, but within certain kind of confines. And it would appear that only about half of Americans can have a favorable view of China, and only about a little over half of Americans have an unfavorable view of China. And then there's like, you know, it's kind of fluctuates in that range. So there is some stability, actually, in the U.S.-China relationship within those constraints. In any given year, there might be more unfavorable or more favorable, but over time, it just seems to be a certain amount of stability. Yeah.
Thank you very much for very interesting presentation. Shu Rata from Waseda University.
Yeah.
I have a couple of questions on back of the trade.
Yeah.
I understand that the trade is not the one of the most important issues for Americans, but if you can say the degree of importance changes over time, did it increase or decrease or stay about the same level? That's the first question. And you do this survey in other countries.
Yeah.
And I just wonder if you can find similar lack of interest or important kind of feeling toward trade in other countries, you know, European countries, Japan. And finally, just one, this is a point which, this is a kind of hypothetical question. I'd like to know if Americans are not interested in trade, and although the world is now becoming much, much connected to each other through, through global value chains and so on, I just wonder the differences in kind of primary education, maybe secondary education. When I was a kid, we were taught international trade is very important for us to survive and so on. So we realized, maybe a bit exaggeration, but we realized how important trade is. But I just wonder how the role of international trade is taught in the United States, elementary school, secondary school.
Yeah.
If there are some, differences between these two countries, maybe that may be a part of the reason for the lack of interest in trade for the Americans.
Your question might be, is it taught, rather than how is it taught? I just don't know. That's a good question. It'd be interesting to know and compare how trade is taught or even talked about or even mentioned now compared to, say, textbooks or lesson plans 30 years ago. I mean, it'd be a fascinating study, actually. And you could probably do it because you could probably find those old teaching materials. We unfortunately don't ask people the same trade questions in other countries that we do in the U.S. That's a good idea. That's like why I like to do these, because that's a very good. We should at least once ask people, how important is this to your country? Not just how do you feel about trade, but relative to other things, how important this is to your country. In fact, the importance of trade to the American hasn't changed in 16 years. It's just down at the bottom, and it's relatively the same number every year. It's on our website. You can see it just really doesn't change very much. So in terms of that issue, it just not there's no evidence that it's becoming more important. Yeah, anyone? Yeah, one final? Yeah. Oh, hi.
Takaki Asano, I'm a researcher now with the Symptom Corporation. Now, there are tons of policies that people don't care about, and nevertheless, those policies go on. And you said that most voters care less about trade. Nevertheless, politicians keep bringing it up. NAFTA, TPP. What is the political motivation on the part of politicians, what is the political dynamic behind these public discourse in terms of trade? If trade policy is politically irrelevant, why do they bring it up?
Well, I think there's two things. One question you could ask is, if Democrats in the general public now think trade's good for the country, trade agreements are good for the country, and Republicans don't, why is it the debate in Congress still sometimes the old debate, which is the Democrats are more critical and Republicans are more free trade? Well, part of it could be that the politicians realize, well, I can do whatever I want on trade because my people don't really care about this. They have opinions, but they don't care. I mean, one of the interesting things will be is that as you get a new generation of Democrats in Congress and a new generation of Republicans in Congress, does that notion we have that at least the debate in Congress is between protectionist Democrats and free trade Republicans, does that change because these are a new generation of politicians with kind of more reflect the underlying voter? Or we also have to acknowledge that labor unions tend to be critical of trade, and they give a lot of money to Democrats, and businesses supportive of trade, and they give a lot of money to Republicans. So does that kind of dominate? And can it dominate because those politicians realize my voters really don't care that much about this? And you're right. There's a lot of issues that the public opinion is kind of irrelevant to, because it just kind of carries on, because it's not of a high enough concern. Now, why do politicians sometimes bring it up? You'd have to ask them, but I think they at least know that it resonates with a part of their base. And we know from the data on Republican sentiment, and we know from the success of Donald Trump, that his base feels pretty strongly about this issue. So it worked for him in part because he could appeal to that base. And, because in the United States everybody doesn't have to vote, it's all about turnout on election day. And if an issue resonates with your base and you get them out to the polls, that's useful, even though maybe the broader kind of Republican base it feels differently or doesn't really care about this issue. But if it's a motivational issue for your voters, and that's why politicians hit on certain ispublics. The Democrats hit on health care in this last election cycle, and it seemed to work in the terms of it was what the public said was their most important issue. And immigration seemed to be an issue the president at least thought would motivate his base to come out. Yeah. No, you. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Okay.
Excuse me. May I ask in Japanese? My name is Oikawa from Yomiuri newspaper. I would like to ask you a question about the results of the election. 2 years ago, Mr. Trump had the victory. One of the major contributing factor was the support from the Rust Belt poor white base workers. I think that was a major factor to bring Mr. Trump to presidency. But this midterm election, in that region, Republicans necessarily didn't win, and some victory went to Democrats. So Republicans had a hard time in that area. Does this mean that enthusiastic support for Trump among those fans 2 years ago started to decline? Does it mean that? Or this time it's a House election, different from presidential election, so that's the reason why the results different? Well, what would you say?
I think, the short answer is we don't know, because the data's not all in yet, and it'll have to be analyzed more closely. I mean, I can give you an example. My hometown in western Pennsylvania, so it's a Rust Belt. Donald Trump got 60% of the vote. And the congressman from that district, who's a Republican and a very strong Trump supporter, didn't even have an opponent in 2016. This year he had an opponent. He still won, but he only won by 7 percentage points. It was just, a strong victory, but he actually had an opponent. He didn't have an opponent 2 years ago. So it's hard to say, really. I think we'll have to wait and see. I mean, that would suggest in that one district, your thesis might be right. But on the other hand, there's a lot of other places where the president did really. There's an analysis out there that, I don't know if it's right, but it's done by David Wasserman, a guy I really trust, that in districts that Trump carried by 5 to 7 percentage points, the Republicans didn't lose at all. They didn't lose anything. So red Trump districts, strong red, the Republicans did pretty well. So it would suggest maybe your thesis is wrong, that in fact those really strong didn't kind of shift. But obviously there were some districts that were kind of mildly Trump in 2016 that went over to the Democrats because the Democrats picked up some congressional districts that Trump had won in the past. I'm thinking of 2 districts in Texas where they flipped, and the district in Kansas City that flipped. And I mean, there are a number of districts like that as well. Yeah.
My name is Hara, teaching at the Kyoto University of Foreign Studies after retiring from Gaimusho. And could you kindly illustrate demographic changes in the last few decades in the United States, particularly the influx of the Hispanic population? And also, could you envisage the demographic picture 30 years later, around 2050 or so, say, with the influx of the legal or illegal immigrants from Hispanic, say, areas, say, and also their birth rate is pretty high. Could you please?
Well, I mean, first off, we've all heard the phrase demography is destiny. And I would like to remind us all that demography has always been destiny, but it doesn't mean necessarily today. It tends to always take longer than those projections think. But the projections are that by 2050, in fact, I think earlier than that, we will be a majority-minority country. In other words, if you add up the number of minorities, blacks, Hispanics, Asians, that will be the majority of the population. We already have a number of states like that. California, I think Texas is if not already, will soon be, Arizona, Florida. The influx of Hispanics has actually peaked in terms of migrants, and it's going down. And we have a lot of good data on that because we do more surveys of Hispanic Americans than anybody else does, and all the data is there on our website. The fastest growing group of immigrants in the United States today are Asians. And Indian Asians, by the way, are the richest and best educated immigrants we have ever had in our history. For example, we have now had the governors of 2 southern states that were Indian Americans, but, of Indian extraction. They're both Republicans and one was a woman. Now, if you had asked me 30 years ago, would any of that? No, I would, given we did, but we're a changing country very fast. What that will mean for elections and voting, people speculate all the time. I think I would warn you not to presume. I mean, I know some Democrats who presume this. I know some Republicans who presume, Democrats will be in control forever once that happens, because these groups all now vote strongly Democratic. Yeah, and blacks used to vote strongly Republican for years until the Depression, and then they switched over and now vote strongly Democratic. So these things change over time. The Republican Party believes they can win over Hispanic voters. George W. Bush got 40% of the Hispanic vote in 2000. Now, he was the governor of Texas before that. You know, people seem to have associated him with policies that might help Hispanics. And Republicans believe that Hispanics can be brought over to the Republican side on social values issues because many of them are very religious. So even if demography is destiny and we're going to become a majority-minority country, that doesn't mean that the Democratic hold on those voters is going to, predestine them to be in control. Now, Democrats probably hope that, but right now, though, Hispanics, blacks, and Asians vote overwhelmingly Democratic. The other issue is that those minorities tend to be concentrated in certain places. They aren't spread evenly across the entire nation. So I think their electoral impact will be concentrated in some places, but it just reinforces, at least immediately, the Democrats' challenge, which is they're strong in the cities and they're strong in the coasts, and then in the middle of the country they're not so strong. And to give you an example, that town I grew up in, the town I mentioned, in the 18 years I lived there, I had never seen or spoken to a Hispanic. And I had spoken to 2 African Americans by the time I was 18 years old. And I had actually knew one Asian because she was an adopted Chinese girl, So some of these communities, at least in the past, have been lily white. Now they're changing. In that community, there is now an Indian Hindu temple. I remember thinking, those Russian Orthodox or those Greek were kind of weird because they had incense and they kissed icons. But, I wonder what those people in that town think about this Hindu temple. But the point is, America is changing rapidly in my lifetime, and I think we have to expect that to continue. 13 to 14% of the population is now foreign-born. That is the highest it has been in our history, tied with the 1840s, the 1880s, the 1920s, and today. What happened in all those 4 periods when it reached 13 to 14%? We had a populist backlash. So, watch this space. Is that going to continue, and what is the political reaction going to be? We don't know. But history suggests that there have been backlashes. Yeah.
I'm Hiroshi Meguro. I usually focus on Okinawa, but my question is about President Trump's focus. Political focus. And it's related to Mr. Oikawa's question. And 2 years ago, the presidential campaign, Mr. Trump focused on the confrontation between the Rust Belt and establishment. And, but these days, he doesn't mention very much the establishment. He bashed establishment in the past, but these days, not. He doesn't. And do you think that the issue is gone?
The polling data doesn't suggest it. The polling data suggests that anti-establishment sentiment's still pretty strong. I guess it's not my observation that he has stopped bashing. He attacks the news media on almost a daily basis, which is part of the establishment. He attacks. He doesn't attack Washington the way he did, but it's a little hard to attack Washington when you're in control of Washington. But we'll see what happens, in the run-up to the next election. I guess it depends what you mean by the establishment. But the polling data is pretty clear that the public still has an anti-establishment bent. And certainly some of the potential Democratic candidates attack the establishment, whether it's Wall Street or big business or things of that. But, when it gets down to it, it's only a couple of things that are the establishment. There's, it's business, it's the political elites, and the public doesn't feel that great about the political, kind of institutions. I mean, I think the most recent Gallup poll, support for Congress was 23%, and that was actually up. So from that point of view, anti-establishment sentiment is still pretty high. Now, how the president might play with that, I just don't know. We'll see whether he embraces the democratically controlled Congress or not. Yeah, Ambassador.
Well, thank you very much, Bruce. I want to ask some journalistic questions at the end about Washington politics. We all know that there is a House dominated by the Democrat this time. General reading is that there will be a messy, nasty battle between the Trump administration and House Democrats, whether it is immigration policy or budget or setting the wall or Obamacare stuff, and even infrastructure building possibly. Yeah. There is some common interest in there, but still people predict that there will be some messy battle going on, right? So what's reading, in Obama administration, when he was kind of not successful in dealing with the Congress, he tried to go on its own way, right? Whether it is environment policy and using executive power to do the job. What do you predict? If there is a messy situation in Washington, does the president go for further on the executive prerogative right and on its own, or with the Senate more like Trump party, I hope, and try to maneuver and try to make a deal. He's a deal maker. He wants to be successful. Do you think that which way he will go?
Well, I mean, you mentioned a number of substantive issues. I mean, the other thing that the Democratic majority has already said they're going to do is launch a series of investigations of the administration. Every committee is going to be launching investigations of the administration. So that in itself will change the kind of atmosphere and the tenor of the relationship. We don't know what they'll find, but they've promised to do that. So that's going to complicate matters, I think, further. We should remember that, one, that Donald Trump has already acted with a number of executive actions. Obama did a lot of that when he was frustrated, as you said, and Trump, even though he controlled both houses of Congress, acted a lot with executive actions. So that would be one option to go in that direction. The other thing is we shouldn't forget is that Richard Nixon negotiated a major arms control agreement with the Russians in the middle of Watergate. So presidents have a lot of discretion internationally when they're kind of besieged at home. So that would be another option for the president to pursue, to try to do more stuff internationally. And remember that the deal that Nixon did with the Russians was actually a very good deal. I mean, it was the first major arms control agreement with the Russians. So it wouldn't necessarily have to be bad international things or things that cause trouble. It could be actually some good stuff that everybody would agree to. So we'll just have to see how that plays out. But the history would suggest doing more things internationally might be one of the avenues the president might pursue.
Well, thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you all.
I think you have done a great job, and I wish you success. I hope you will come back again. Thank you very much.
本日は長い時間にわたってご参加くださり誠にありがとうございました。これにて閉会とさせていただきたいと思います。